From the Agros perspective, the reason we're here is, we start these villages down in Central America in the rural areas where many of these children and their families live. And largely poverty in Central America is a rural issue. And what we try to do is build wholesome communities, people who come together in these communities and then get an integrated, sort of coordinated effort of the things that we take for granted in this country. So we try to bring to them education, health, land, expertise and education about how to use the land and get access to markets. So these communities have a chance on their own to thrive and be sustainable. And it's my belief, without sort of any real empirical data yet, to tell you that in these villages, it is the very last thing in the world a parent or a child wants to do is to trek 1,300 miles with strangers on the top of a train, facing potential death, facing rape, facing all kinds of things to get to the United States if they have a future in their own country. And I just think that's sort of an inarguable fact. Who would send a child on that kind of dangerous journey if you had a perfectly good community where you lived? So that's the reason Agros is involved, is I think that we can avoid a lot of the discourse that's going on, the negative discourse in our country, if we just focused on solving the problem and preventing it from happening where it exists. That's why I'm here. So I don't have any other expertise on that except to sort of plug that what we're doing, I think, keeps us all from getting angry at each other, which is a good thing. So I'll turn it over to these wonderful women who have decided to come and be with us today, and thank you for doing that, especially early in the morning. Both of them mentioned to me that this is too early for them. I appreciate you guys being here. So please tell us a little bit about your organization, about you, and sort of the way you see the problem.
So my name is Stephanie Lennon. I am the foster home recruiter at the Refugee, Immigrant Children's Program of Lutheran Community Services, which is a very long title. But basically, I work for an organization that has been working with unaccompanied minors since about 1980. So we work with kids who don't have parents. They're in some sort of war situation. In the case of our Central American youth, they're fleeing all the things that Don just mentioned. And they are granted some form of legal relief. So they're in the country, but they have no family members, and they really just don't have a future. So we work with those kids. We place them in foster homes in the United States, and we just really sort of help them to rebuild their lives here because they don't have the opportunity to ever go home again, which is very unfortunate. So my background, I've done refugee resettlement and refugee employment for about 6 years in the Seattle area. I've been with this program for about 6 months. I sort of initially got into all of this. I had gone to Rwanda and Uganda to do some sort of peace and conflict studies research, and ended up visiting a lot of refugee camps and a lot of internally displaced persons camps, where there were a lot of children, and there were a lot of children who were alone. There were a lot of children whose parents had been killed, and you would just see these camps that were all kids and very few adults. The adults that were there were often severely injured, and these kids were really on their own. And so that just sort of translated through the work that I've done. I'm now getting my Master of Public Administration at Seattle University, so that I can work on public policy issues focused on sort of immigration and some of these issues. But I think what Don mentioned, we are really coming at this from a child welfare standpoint. These really are kids, and we see them every day. And they are just like any other kid. They're hilarious, and they're dealing with their own things. We work with a lot of teenagers who are, they want the cool clothes, and they want to, buy a computer, and they're just like, your kids, or how I remember myself being at that age. But they're survivors, and they've done so much with their lives, and they're really focused on education and rebuilding their lives. And it is something that, it's definitely not their first choice. It's something they never could have imagined, to see their parents killed in front of them, or to have death threats against them at very young ages. And it's unimaginable, but it's something that has been going on, that we've been seeing for about 10 years now. Since around 2003 was when we really saw these Central American kids starting to come over in larger numbers, and it's just sort of grown exponentially every year since then, until we got to this point where we're seeing 60,000 up to maybe 100,000 by the end of this year. So that's sort of where we are, and it's just focusing on the kids, focusing on them as people, and just sort of trying to work with the public on understanding what's really happening in their lives and what sort of got them here.
My name is Mary Beth. I am an immigration attorney in Kent. I know Agros because I applied for a job there in 2004 and didn't get the job. And because of that, I decided to go to law school. Before that, I went to undergrad at Pacific Lutheran. I volunteered with Mennonite Central Committee in Bolivia for 3 years. Those of you who are familiar with MCC's work can contextualize that a bit. So I speak fluent Spanish and went to law school knowing that I wanted to go into immigration law. And it's what I've done since then. I worked for 2 years for a nonprofit in Seattle that handles pro bono placement for all of the detained unaccompanied youth in Seattle. We'll talk a little bit about what that means in a second. But I think one thing that's important to understand off the bat is that all immigration proceedings, immigration law, because it is civil law, not criminal law, there's no right to an attorney at public expense. And that is true for adults and children. So these children have no right to a government paid attorney. That just brings up so many problems, particularly right now with this surge of cases. The efforts that nonprofits in the area are making to find volunteer attorneys to represent kids on a moment's notice. I got a call from the court Monday, right before our conference call, saying we need about 10 volunteer attorneys at our docket on Thursday morning, mobilized. The problem of our court system trying to process these cases through so quickly is just immense. Anyway, so I worked for a couple years with a nonprofit in Seattle, training and mentoring pro bono attorneys to take these detained unaccompanied youth cases. Right now, I did that for a couple years. I moved back down to Kent, so I'm a private attorney now in Kent, but I still do a lot of work with unaccompanied youth and still mentor attorneys that are trying to take dependency cases through the dependency court. And I'm the pro bono chair for Washington State for immigration attorneys, which is why I got the call from the court. So I will be talking a little bit about what the legal system, how the legal system is handling these cases, has handled these cases, and how we've seen a change literally within the last few weeks. A change in policy coming from the Obama administration, particularly as it relates to the children. But Stephanie, because she does a lot more of the touchy-feely, important work, has very sympathetic stories, and so I'm hoping that she can talk a little bit more about some of the stories of the children. Another context thing that I wanted to mention, Lutheran Community Services, no, I don't want to speak for LCS. I just wanted to say that Stephanie's program, like some of your cases, Stephanie, are the kids that, like you said, have already qualified for legal relief, and because of that, can be placed with foster care families.
Yes, not all of them, but we can get into that.
Yeah. There's a whole, not every child that comes to the U.S. is eligible for legal relief.
Yeah.
And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I think it's important to understand that there are really there's good infrastructure in place to help some children that qualify for legal relief to stay in the United States. The kids that don't qualify for legal relief and end up needing to be repatriated is a whole nother topic.
Yeah. I can talk a little bit about sort of what that means and sort of the, that process and what happens to kids when they do get sent back home.
So both of you have mentioned the surge, or all three of you, of all of a sudden this media attention and this sense that there are so many more kids coming, or at least attention on it. Talk to us a little bit about the causes. Is this really a new problem, as it's somewhat being portrayed in the media? And Stephanie, you alluded to the history, that it really isn't. Maybe why all of a sudden this media attention, and what some of those root causes are, why the numbers seem to be growing exponentially, as you talked about.
Yeah, so we started seeing these kids coming over in fairly large numbers. It would be a few thousand a year in about 2003. I think contextually, prior to that, children were placed, if they came across the border, they were placed in detention centers with adults. They were, it's not a child welfare setting. If you've heard anything about the detention center in Tacoma, you've probably heard it is very much a jail. They're really not good conditions. So there was a lawsuit that basically has led to children are now under the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, who has been resettling unaccompanied refugee minors from Africa, Asia, other countries since 1979, and we have been doing that work since 1980. So essentially, after that lawsuit, it was decided that immigration would no longer have custody of those children. They would be placed in the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, who could actually provide some child welfare work. So after that, we started seeing those kids entering into our program. They qualify for the exact same services as our refugee youth. And really what's been happening in Central America has been going on for quite a while. And we saw sort of steady increases. The numbers were maybe doubling every year from about 2003 until about 2011. And 2011 to present, they stopped doubling. They just went up exponentially, and just up and up and up and up. Over half of the kids that we have worked with from Central America total have arrived since 2011. And it's just, if we had enough families, we could place a kid almost every day. It's just that many kids. But essentially what's happening, there's not one super clear answer. Honduras is the murder capital of the world. There is one city in Honduras that I'm forgetting the name of because I'm not a morning person. Yes, thank you. So and that is, the murder capital of the murder capital. And there's, the data on that of kids leaving Honduras is a lot of them are coming from this one specific place, because what's happening is their parents are being murdered, they're getting, kids are being killed. The percentage of child murders in Honduras is skyrocketed in the last year, and it's continuing to go up. There's a lot of retaliation. Kids are being forced into gangs, forced into drug trafficking, just forced into some really bad situations. El Salvador has extreme poverty. And sort of all three countries, there's very high murder rates. El Salvador and Guatemala are 4 and 5, sort of in the world murder rates. And also there's been a lot of child murders, a lot of parents being killed, often in front of their children. And so kids are leaving, and families are trying to leave because the alternative is death, or some really horrible things. And for a parent, if the choices are that your child dies or they go on this other harrowing journey, that's not a decision made lightly. It's a decision made out of desperation. And for kids who don't have families, they really have no other choice. They don't want to have to join a gang. They don't want to get involved in drugs. They're really running for their lives. And so the numbers are just going up and up. There's a little bit of an aspect of a rumor mill that people thought that if kids got here, they would be allowed to stay, which now we're sort of seeing that information that's very incorrect is starting to filter back, because about 90% of kids are getting sent back. They do not have permanent legal relief. We work with the very small minority of kids who are lucky enough, for a lot of reasons, one of which is that they do not have lawyers. They don't speak English, and if you're a 10-year-old kid, you can't get through that process. You can't speak in front of a judge and tell your story, and it's just unimaginable to put a child through that. So that's sort of, some of the reasons for the numbers. The media attention has been crazy. I'm our media representative, and we've been getting just constant calls, and reporters really trying to break this as a news story. I've been getting calls from investigative reporters who are sort of trying to like feed me these really leading questions because they want this to be new. They want there to be some new angle on it, and the answer is that it's not new. It's just really been pushed into the public eye because of all of this sort of controversy over immigration, and it's just sort of pushing it to the forefront. But I think what's being forgotten in all of that is that these are kids, and they're kids who are alone, and they're kids who are afraid. And so I think that that's really been something that we've seen a lot of, and that's been a really big problem for us, is people sort of just getting this misinformation from the media about what's happening.
Mary Beth, do you have something you want to add to that?
The only piece I would add that I've learned, El Salvador and El Salvador tends to be, and Honduras. The narrative of stories coming from El Salvador and Honduras is I'm fleeing because of gang violence. The narrative that I more often hear from Guatemala is I'm fleeing because of domestic violence. U.S. law, U.S. immigration law, it is very hard for a child who is fleeing gang violence to qualify for legal relief in the United States. I'd say, let's see, I've been successful maybe 5 out of 100 times. It's incredibly difficult under U.S. asylum law. Domestic violence cases, there is very good protection for children fleeing domestic violence. So we tend to be a little bit more successful with kids from Guatemala. El Salvador and Honduras, it's much more difficult.
Yeah, and we see that a lot as well. Kids getting relief because of domestic violence issues.
People are fleeing something that's dangerous. They're doing exactly what humans do, what all animals do. They're trying to survive. So this idea that there's something magical about being in the United States is really not very true. It is simply the safest haven for somebody to get to from where they are. The point about that, though, is for us to really begin to think that we cannot insulate ourselves from these things. The reason this is affecting us is because they're our neighbors. If we were a Middle Eastern country, we would be facing a larger problem due to the Syrian conflict. Ukraine's going to face a similar problem. It happens all over the world. So the question is that as we look at our country, how do we look more broadly at the Americas? And we take for granted, for example, this wonderful neighbor to the north, which we've never had a problem with. Could we do that in the South? Is there a way to create a more stable America so that we don't have to even get into these conversations, right? And that's sort of the vision and dream that I think is where Agros comes in, is that's the reason we really are in Central America. That's one of the reasons why we want to work there, is if we could create a place where people only come to the United States because they want to be tourists, or vice versa. That would be a wonderful thing to do.
Before we turn it over to the audience for questions, talk to us a little bit about the detention process for children. What does it look like once a child arrives here?
So there are a few sort of different paths. Essentially what happens, as Don mentioned, kids are riding these trains that are called the Beast because they're so dangerous. We've had kids who said they rode 17 different trains, and that means every time they're jumping on often a moving train, they're riding on the top, there are people who are preying on them. It's incredibly dangerous. There's a lot of kids who start out traveling together and they don't all make it. They're having to cross these deserts or rivers. I have family members who are Border Patrol in Texas, and they said every single day now they're getting phone calls that there's a body in the desert, there's a body in the river, and it's a child, and they have to go get it. And I think it's interesting because even they have said, these are the kids who need help. I think people think of Border Patrol agents as being very anti-immigrant, but they are saying, these are the kids who need help. Like, please help these kids. So kids are sort of, they're apprehended by the Border Patrol at some point. They're not here with any malintent. They're just here because they've heard that it's a place that they could be safe, and that often ends up not being true, and they end up being put back into a worse situation. So from that point, there are kids that if they do qualify for some sort of legal relief, we work with a fantastic group of pro bono lawyers that I would say about 99% of our kids from Central America would not get to stay without them. it's just, the system is too overwhelming. It's very difficult for, people who don't have a legal background to help them navigate that in any way. Kids in the shelters are given, sometimes, depending on what organizations are around, a Know Your Rights presentation in Spanish. They're often like an hour long. And kids they can't retain that information. They're not going to remember when they're in front of this scary judge and there's a prosecutor there, there's someone arguing against them, and they're not going to remember what their rights are. They're going to clam up and they're just going to be terrified. And so, we operate a long-term foster care program. So for kids who have already made it through and have gotten some form of legal relief, there's some kids who've already gotten that, but there are other kids who are waiting. And we've seen kids who, they're waiting for that status, they're in a foster home, they're safe, but in their minds, all they can think about is what happens if I don't get it? Because, they're failing in school, they're very smart kids, they're failing in school, they're acting out because they're terrified. And, we've had kids who, the day they got their immigration status, it was like we met a new person. Like, they are so relieved, they get really focused on school. It's like the whole world opens up for them because they're safe and they don't have to worry about that anymore. While at the same time dealing with the fact that they've lost everything. They've lost their country, their language, their food, their music, their family members. A lot of them have seen family killed or friends killed in front of them. And they're also dealing with all of this trauma at the same time they're trying to navigate this incredibly complicated system that really is just, fighting tooth and nail against them. So there's, the chance for kids to actually stay here in reality is very slim. Foster care is really the only option for these kids to get support once they're here. There are only 21 programs like ours across the entire country. They're very localized. We are Seattle-based. We can really only serve King, Snohomish, parts of Pierce, parts of Kitsap counties. There's another organization in Tacoma, and we are one of the only states that has 2 programs, but we still don't serve the entire state. So it's really, these kids, whether they're with family members, they're, sort of able to get some legal relief. If they turn 18, they are no longer eligible for foster care, and there are almost no services for them. There's essentially nothing other than, food stamps and, what the general population sees. So we are on a huge time crunch, especially in this state. Kids have to go through what's called a dependency hearing. And those hearings in this state can take, they're taking 6-7 months. They're taking incredibly long time for us to essentially assume custody of these kids. In other states, it can take 2 weeks. So there's a lot of stuff going on through the Office of Refugee Resettlement, just talking to programs and saying, we have a 17-and-a-half-year-old, what state can take this kid and what state can get them to that point before they turn 18? And there are kids aging out all over the country. It happens all the time. We have kids that we start working with, they're in a foster family, and then they turn 18 and they're done. We have to take them out of that foster family who may, they may have started to form these bonds with, and a lot of kids end up back on the street where they started. Youth Care in Seattle actually works with a lot of kids who are homeless. They're getting involved in drugs again. They're getting involved in some really bad things again because they have no option. So it's crucial for us to try to find foster families, to have somewhere to put these kids, because there's just, the alternative is, they could stay in this country, but they end up working under the table, they end up getting involved in some bad things just to try to survive, and it's really, really difficult. And we have kids, who have friends that, they were in a shelter with, or they were in a foster home setting with, and, they'll say, they're like, I am so thankful for this, because I see what happens to kids who stay here, and it's exactly like what home was like, and it's just, and they're, they're saying, they're like, why is this happening? These kids are so concerned about their other, their friends and their other kids, and they're seeing these terrible things happening, and they're still saying, I don't want to be involved in that. I don't want to be involved in drugs. I'm so glad that I was able to get this before I turned 18, because it's huge for them.
Can I just sum up, because it's not...
Yeah, I was just
I want to respect everybody's time. I think that it's fascinating to listen to the conversation, and Matt, you guys brought it back to my legal nature. You're thinking about the particular arguments you can make to try and win these cases. Maybe one way to sum this up is to say there was this principle I learned in business. It was written in a bunch of business books called the 1-10-100 principle. And the theory behind it was that if you have a problem and the first person that deals with that problem solves it, it's won and it's done. The problem's over. If that person punts it, it takes 10 people to solve that same problem. And if those 10 people punt it, it now takes 100 people. And I think what you're seeing right here is playing out the 1-10-100 principle. Once these kids get to our borders, it's now at the 100 level. It takes lawyers, it takes judges, it takes all kinds of stuff. You have to create a system for doing this. The system's not quite right. You get politically, you get people on either side of the spectrum. It becomes a huge issue, and it's costly. It's hugely costly. If you solve this problem at the source, that money that you're spending at the 100 principle would go so much further, and you would leverage so much more, not to even mention how many lives you'd be saving and how much hope and opportunity you'd be creating. So I think maybe we'll just leave you with that thought. I know we'll still be here to talk to anybody who wants to stay. There's still some pastries and coffee. Andy, do you want to sum up?
Yeah, and I just want to thank all three of you for being part of this. This has been a great conversation. They will be here for a little bit longer. If you have specific questions, come up. We also have some literature out on the table. There's literature both about Agros, about Lutheran Community Services, but also some provocative articles for you to take away if you want to think more about this topic. I want to also invite you already. Our next in this series of events will be on Wednesday, October 15th. We will have staff members from Nicaragua here to talk about what Agros is doing about our community members' health and well-being. And so we'd love to have you come back and join us again. Thank you very much for coming out this morning. We really appreciate you being here.
Thanks to you guys.